I'm Aaron Fogelman, a veteran of the U.S. Army, and I would like to welcome you to our service. And I would also like to welcome those attending virtually. Can we get them to join us on the screen now? There they are. Okay. Sometimes we wave, so if you want to wave at everybody here, welcome. Thanks for coming, one way or the other. We're glad you're here. Okay. Afghanistan. It's over, at least for the U.S. as far as the fighting goes. What should we make of it? It was a long, awful war that from the beginning to the end, the U.S. public and presidents viewed almost entirely from their own perspectives, with relatively little empathy for what actually happened in Afghanistan, why, and what it meant to Afghan people. What should we make of it? In the immediate aftermath of the end, people typically try to make sense of it all. And that is what Americans and others are doing right now. If and when you do this, I encourage you to consider that it was not just about us. The war was fought, won, and lost primarily by Afghans, and it is they who continue to endure the most suffering from it. It is tough for Americans to consider other viewpoints in the many wars in which they have fought, but doing so will help you better understand what has happened in history and continues to happen today. Last summer, almost no American believed continued U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan was a good idea. There were clearly issues with the final withdrawal. I don't know exactly what happened, and neither does anyone else unless they were in the inner circles. But it is a mistake to ascribe the final outcome to last-minute U.S. decision-making and planning, as that perpetuates the larger problem of ignoring the people who live there and seeing everything through an American lens. That is what led to the problem in the first place, and it's been a problem frequently in U.S. history. These recent developments and news about what U.S. veterans of the war in Afghanistan were saying motivated us to reflect on our thoughts about the places where we served, and what they mean to us now, many years later, after the U.S. military role in Afghanistan has ended. Hence the theme, where we were in this year's service. In addition to 3 readings on this subject, Lynn Steele will introduce a special offering for this month's Beyond Our Walls, and Tracy McFadden will provide a special remembrance of Al Drover, a veteran and longtime member of the UUSG whom we lost a few months ago. And backed by popular demand, our veterans band, Tracy, Brian Josie, and friends, will provide musical entertainment and reflections. Thank you for coming. We hope you get something out of today's service. And now let me introduce Larry Escalona, who will provide our first reading.
Thank you, Aaron. I would like to discuss a comparison of how Germany handled their recovery after World War II and how Afghanistan is currently addressing the end of their recent war. When I was in the Army, I lived in West Germany from 1981 to 1982. At the time, it was officially the Federal Republic of Germany. I was assigned to the 1st Armored Division in Bamberg, which is just north of Nuremberg and only 25 miles from East Germany. Officially, then the German Democratic Republic. At that time, American military and civilian presence were welcomed and appreciated. Post-World War II, the Allied forces were focused on the structural rebuilding of West Germany. The Germans valued our protection against a possible Soviet invasion. We must remember that the Berlin Wall still existed, and an Iron Curtain had been drawn across Europe. In contrast to the accomplishments in Germany, a very similar American effort in Afghanistan has faced minimal effectiveness. I would like to provide a detailed comparison between the post-war activity in Germany and current activity in Afghanistan. Former enemies of each country actively participated and assisted in funding reconstruction when the fighting ended. For example, the US, the UK, and France were all allies who helped rebuild Germany after the fall of the Nazis. These countries and other also tried to rebuild Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Initially, in both post-war Germany and in Afghanistan, the US and other allies controlled the initiation of a government, economy, and social programs. The difference between the two nations is multiple. First of all, the Germans were very accepting of a democratic form of government based partially on their Christian orientation. Democracy is completely foreign to Muslim Afghans, however, with a government based on warlord feudalism. Although Germany only had genocide during the Nazi occupation, genocide in Afghanistan continues. This perpetuates civil war in Afghanistan. Over time, Germany had developed into a world-class economic and political system respected worldwide. By contrast, Afghanistan's misuse of funds and lack of cooperative spending has created profound frustration for the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Whereas Germany developed a highly functioning and effective police force, approximately half of the Afghan military and police personnel returned to serve feudalistic warlords. The warlords have consolidated control over much of the rest of the country, increasing the number of human rights violations and genocide and lawlessness in the process. Further, although Nazism was banned in Germany, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda have returned to Afghanistan for power. Today, the Taliban has succeeded in regaining complete control. In conclusion, regardless of US efforts, there is no sign of peaceful, cooperative, and economically sound government in Afghanistan as there was in Germany. Thank you.
I am Len Steele, and I was trained at Fort Sill II just a few years later. And today I will share some thoughts about the end of the Afghan War and the end of the Vietnam War. We have seen pictures this year of Afghanistan, which can easily be compared to the fall of Saigon in April of 1975. But these images can have a different psychological effect on veterans like me who engaged in combat rather than support troop veterans who never saw combat. In both wars, it's hard to reconcile the loss of war buddies and the destruction and injury and death that frontline combat troops caused and witnessed when it was all for a lost cause. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in DC has 58,281 names on it, and more than that number died in the first 10 years after the end of the war to diseases related to injuries or exposure to Agent Orange or to suicide. But as important as Veterans Day is in remembering those sacrifices, we also need to remember how our policies affected those in foreign lands. I have shared parts of my personal journey in the war and after with the congregation in the past. In those readings, I emphasized my hiding my veteran status for the first 10 years, my journey in understanding PTSD, and recently grasping an understanding of moral injury. But because of the events of this year, I want to raise awareness to the price paid by the people in countries we were trying to help. My fire base in Vietnam was located between Quy Nhon and Da Nang, and we were attacked by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese soldiers every night. We were on a supply spur off of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which the North was protecting, and we were attempting to disrupt. And we were good at disrupting, and they were good at hitting back. We were in the foothills of the Central Highlands, which are covered in jungle, but our fire base was all dirt because Agent Orange was applied monthly. I thank my fellow citizens for funding my VA treatment of the 2 diseases I have developed related to Agent Orange. I recently was able to see some pictures posted by 2 infantrymen who returned to LZ Uplift to remember their fallen buddies. The pictures show how the area has grown back to jungle landscape that was there before the war and the use of Agent Orange. But in this same location, the head of the Vietnamese Army, General Giap, had this memorial built to those who lost their lives trying to eliminate our base and eliminate me. It glorifies war in ways I find especially offensive, but I am glad I saw these pictures. Although these images do not give me peace, they do bring me a sort of closure. And they make me remember the true results of war, which reach beyond the sacrifices of those who did the fighting on both sides. I remember all those ordinary people who suffered because we prolonged their civil war. During our involvement in Vietnam, 1 million North Vietnamese combatants and 250,000 South Vietnamese combatants died, but over 2 million civilians died. So it gives me comfort to see that we have finally ended yet another lost cause, which also added to the suffering of that population in Afghanistan with their 200,000 civilian deaths and the many individuals and families permanently scarred. War and the readiness for war may be necessary in a hostile world, especially if we're attacked. But I would hope that when we choose war, we also see the bigger picture of what that initial action and continuing that war beyond the initial objectives will mean to ordinary people. Those civilians don't always comprehend the reasons for the conflict, but they pay the same price as the combatants and deserve to be honored by remembering their loss as we plan future conflicts.
Okay, but I'm going to talk about Germany in the 20th century, where I was. I was there in the Army in the 1980s. And when I was there, it was clear that I was part of a large trajectory of historical events that were dramatically changing the place during this century. This is true one way or another for most veterans who served overseas, and it can contribute to the development of certain feelings about the place. It certainly did for me. The 3 most important turning points historically for Germany in the 20th century occurred in 1918, 1945, and 1989, as military defeat, collapsed regimes, division, and reunification dramatically changed how government worked and how most people lived. Through it all, the forces of militarism, fascism, capitalism, communism, and democracy shaped life and death in the place. I was there after the period of defeat, guilt, and recovery, and during a period of continued denial and the experiment of creating greater democracy under separate capitalist and communist governments. Our role was to help defend democracy and a capitalist state that included many features that some Americans, unfortunately, still label socialism. We were nearing 1989, but we didn't know it, and all this occurred under the threat of nuclear warfare. The place where I was never found all of the solutions to dealing with its past, but it did reunite without war and ended an awful, corrupt political regime in the East. And it also marginalized the worst of militarism and fascism within its society, in some ways better than those who defeated them in 1945. I was stationed in Germany in the 1980s with 75% of all overseas US troops at the time, about 200,000, and that included Larry and me. Now there are about 38,000 US troops in Germany, second only to Japan as far as where we currently have forces stationed. When I was there, many, if not most, were conscious only of a truncated Germany. The East, German Democratic Government, DDR, was not on the radar as a real place with many people. It was kind of a vague territory, something where bad things happened. I saw army manuals with maps of Germany that were missing the eastern states. There were references among the military and civilian populations here and in West Germany to German government and society, but what they really meant was the Federal Republic in West Germany. I was especially irritated by this when I saw West German students doing that. Americans and their families lived primarily on large bases and visited specific tourist sites, and they also visited a lot of restaurants and especially bars. And they counted the days until they could go back to the world. It was amusing to watch how especially the younger kids, 18, 19 years old, were always saying, 30 more days and I go back to the world meaning the United States. We trained to stop a Warsaw Pact invasion. Sometimes we trained with the Bundeswehr, the West German Army, and the French Army. And we would have these ceremonial gatherings, and you'd have to stand at attention while they played 3 national anthems, which takes a long time and it gets very tedious, but it was interesting. I did a lot of liaison work in garrison and in the field because I spoke German. So I learned a lot about town and government, town and village government and culture. In the villages, when we would convoy out there for an exercise, people would run out to the side of the road and wave to us, bring food and drink, give victory signs, and it was nice. It also seemed a little strange at times. I asked a mayor once what that was all about, and he said, well, things are kind of slow in the village, and it gets a lot more interesting when you come, and also we quadruple our income when you come. So that's why they were happy to see us. But many people were not happy to see us. There was a lot of anti-Americanism in Germany, in West Germany at the time, and the East for that matter, but in a different way. They were dramatically expanding the airport, the major airport in Frankfurt, one of the biggest in Europe, if not the world. And at the time, half of it was operated by the US military, and they were expanding that, tearing up a lot of acreage to accomplish that. And there was tremendous resistance and protests, and people would come to do that and give us half of a victory sign. There was also resistance to expansion at the time of nuclear weapons, US nuclear weapons in Germany under the President Reagan's orders. There were violent attacks by remnants of the leftist Baader-Meinhof gang and their affiliates against US targets and other targets. There was also racism, elements and times when Germans didn't like American troops because so many of us were Black and treated us accordingly. I talked to a lot of people, including soldiers who lost in 1945, communists in both the East and the West. I asked if they wanted reunification, and almost all did. In the DDR, I found in some ways even more denial of developments under fascism than I did in West Germany. I also found traces of old militarism in the uniforms. In East Germany after 1945, they didn't change the uniforms, and they were still goose-stepping. On one trip, I was in East Berlin, and I was waiting on the train for Dresden at the cafe in the train station, and there was a young soldier sitting there. He looked like the old German leftist Karl Liebknecht, and he was reading Tolstoy. So I said, I got to sit with this guy. So we shared a table, and we ended up riding on the train together to Dresden. And after a few hours, I said, I'm sorry, but you look like a Nazi wearing that thing. Why are you guys still wearing those uniforms? And he just said, I know it's terrible. We hate all these things, and we hate these uniforms, but they still make us wear them. In the West German army, they changed the uniforms, and they were still gray, but they were different, and they adopted the American style of marching, which is more modest. I wasn't there in the autumn of 1989 when the people in East Germany gathered in the streets and brought down an abusive regime. But I followed events closely in the newspaper and on TV. I returned in the summer of 1990, which was after the Iron Curtain fell, but before reunification had begun, and there was just a tremendous amount of change that developed in the East, especially after that. Throughout the 1990s, I asked people how they liked it there, the changes, especially in the East. And I asked them where they were on this fateful autumn days in 1989, and they loved to talk to you about that. I continue to have a special feeling for the place decades later. It matters to me what happens in Germany, and I go back for all kinds of reasons. I have heard Vietnam veterans say they wanted to go back and see the place when there was no war, and I hope that some US veterans of Afghanistan will eventually be able to do the same, just something like Lynn was able to do. Armed service in war or peace can cause you to hate a place and never want to see it again. But sometimes those harsh views mellow over time. Empathy for the people, or at least the place, develops, and veterans begin to notice what had always been there, a different, perhaps fascinating people and place where people who just mainly want to live without war. Sometimes veterans want to go back and experience the place without the uniforms and the guns, although they will never forget their time when they were there and wore those uniforms and those guns. Thank you.